very much. If there's any problem with hearing me, I normally have a loud, penetrating voice, but if you're having trouble hearing me in the back, I do have a microphone I can use. Wave your hand or something, but I suspect most people will be able to hear me okay. I'm so pleased to be able to come every year, and I just resonate when I get Margaret's email saying, oh boy, she wants me to come back again. I must not have screwed up last year. Something like that, because you guys are the leverage point that I love to talk to. It's great to talk to the kids and telling them about my experiences. Most of them are of an age that they can't really relate to what I have been through, but you guys can. Even if you weren't born at the time a lot of this happened, your parents told you about it and you're aware of it, and as teachers you know more about it than the average person does. And you'll take this experience and the interesting stories, I hope interesting, that I tell you and the experiences I pass along, and you'll internalize them and take them back to your classroom and hopefully repeat them for years to come, and the children over a number of years will benefit from what we'll do here tonight. So that's what I'm hoping for. I always hoped that after we landed on the moon, I knew that 1960 by the year 2000 we would have humans on Mars. There was no question about it. We had absolutely done a phenomenal job. We had gone from a standing start in September of 1962 to landing on the moon in July of 1969. We put together that big Saturn V booster and the spacecraft and did all the analysis and figured out how to do all the operational things that we had to do, and we fulfilled President Kennedy's commitment to the nation. So at that rate of progress, getting to Mars by 2000 was a gimme. That was absolutely going to happen. So I was really looking forward to that. As years passed, I began to get worried about the commitment and whether I had perhaps overestimated the administrative and congressional commitment and the public interest to that. And so at one point in my career in the late 80s and 89 and 90, I was actually for NASA as an agency. I was, my position was manager of Mars exploration, and I was doing all the planning, and President Bush, #1, had asked for a plan to take U.S. astronauts to the moon on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11's landing. So he wanted to get there by July of 2019, and so they asked NASA to put together a plan to do that. I worked on that team that put together that plan, and then when the president said, okay, let's put together a team now and go make that happen, I started out as being the chief engineer for systems engineering and integration, and shortly after the people that were running the program jumped ship, I was the program manager for a couple of years, and so I was really dedicated to getting humans to Mars, and knew that was a possibility in my lifetime. I now realize that was an overestimation, that at my age of 76 almost, it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but it is going to happen. And if it doesn't happen in your lifetime, it will happen during the lifetime of your students. And when I talk to a student group, I always look out and think, which of these students will be key performers on the team that takes humans to Mars? And is there in this room the Neil Armstrong of Mars? And I'm sure as you look at your students, you think the same thing, because in some classroom somewhere today, that's the truth. The Neil Armstrong of Mars is sitting there, doesn't realize what he is. It may be a snotty-nosed little kid that you'd like to send to the principal's office, but by the time he's 45 or 50, he's going to be completely different. So that's why I love to talk to folks like you. You're the people that I want to make contact contact with, that as I continue to do these kind of things and reach students with the programs that I do, so many teachers, you know, just kind of, oh, well, mumble, you know, Norm wants to come and talk to my students. Well, how will that fit in? How will it contribute? Nothing in my you know, class description has anything to do about that. So, you know, whatever. But you folks are different. So I'm gonna try to talk for about 25 minutes here, and then leave 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. How I got here was I'm going to shorten it, but it's an interesting story. I'm a chemical engineer. Went to Rice, then followed up with a master's degree up at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, because I wanted to work in the petrochemical industry in a refinery. And I was raised in Tulsa. University of Tulsa had the finest refinery engineering program in the country. That's what I wanted to do. So I got in there, had a nice scholarship to help pay my way, and I knew I was going to get out and go to work for a refinery and end up being a senior executive at one of the big oil companies somehow or other. All of the engineers I knew as a young man were petroleum engineers or chemical engineers. They worked in the petrochemical industry. That was all I knew. That was my goal, what I wanted to do. I loved science fiction. I read every little science fiction book. You know, I had paper routes in the early 50s, and, you know, I'd get my money that I made on the weekends and go to the drugstore and buy these pulp fiction magazines, you know, that had all the science fiction stories. I just ate that stuff up. But I knew it was science fiction. You know, that was never going to happen in my lifetime. Yeah, in orbit, going to the moon, going to Mars, no way. And so I put my sights on a goal that to me was more realistic, which was refining petroleum and doing it very well and making a profit for the stockholders and moving up that organization. And then lo and behold, the Soviet Union put this little thing up in orbit that went beep, 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 beep. They called it Sputnik, and everybody went nuts, you know. Oh my God, look what the Soviets have done. We can't do that. We tried. We made many spectacular explosions down at Cape Canaveral trying to do that. It turns out that very shortly after Sputnik, we were able to do that. The Navy put up our own satellite, and then to make things worse, Yuri Gagarin got launched in '61, and boy, the world and the nations went bananas again. You know, look how far ahead of the United States the Soviet technology is. Well, it turns out that Alan Shepard, in his suborbital flight, but that was a significant accomplishment, followed Yuri Gagarin by just a couple of months. And 9 months later, John Glenn went into orbit. And so all that suddenly became very, very real, and that was a high priority for the United States. And President Eisenhower formed NASA, and NASA figured out we got to have a human space program. And not only do we want to go into orbit, but we have to have the longer range goal. And we were thinking about going to the moon, and when President Kennedy asked the agency, can we do something that will completely trump the accomplishments of the Soviet Union? For instance, can we send humans to the moon? The agency studied it and went back and told the president, indeed, we can do that. And we did it. And he came down to Houston in September 1962, went over to Rice Stadium over here and made that announcement that we're going to do this. And I was already at work here. I came to work for NASA in May of 1962. And so I am now completed my 51st year here, and I'm entering my 52nd. They did kind of push me out the door in 1998 because I was eligible for retirement, and they were looking to bring in some new fresh blood, but I immediately hired on as a contractor with some of the support people and went to work primarily supporting the education office, which I had always loved because in the later parts of my career I was a deputy director of robotics. And one of the things that when teachers came like you guys, they always wanted to go see the robots. And so they would call my office, and so they wouldn't call the chief of robotics because he was a very gruff individual, had no interest in education at all, and he'd tell them, no, we can't do that. They knew if they called me, probably could work something out. So I would always try to get a nice tour set up. Occasionally, when it wasn't convenient for the lab people to do that, I'd do it myself. And I got to finding out that I enjoyed doing that more than some of the stuff I was doing in the technical area. So when the opportunity came to hire back on, I thought, I believe I'm going to go back and see if I can find something to do in the aerospace education field. And luckily I have done that and keep doing that since 1998, when I did leave the pay of the federal government and went out on my own. I still have a little cubicle in one of the office buildings over here. I don't go in there very often because I've got this helper, and I've got some metal knees and hips and pinched nerves and all that kind of stuff. From the neck up, I'm still okay. But I tell people that NASA really beat me up. Said when I started here, I was 6'1" and could stand up straight. Anyway, I just enjoy the work that I do with students and teachers, and particularly teachers like you. One of the very quickly, I started here. The first thing I worked on when I got here, they had told me, we're hiring you into the energy systems group. I said, what is that? They said, well, we don't know it. There's no description. It just says energy systems. And so I thought, well, I have been to college for 7 years. I have taken advanced calculus courses at 4 different levels. I've taken every kind of chemistry there is. I know heat transfer and combustion processes and furnace design and fluid flow and compressible fluid flow. Whatever they're talking about, that I must know it. So I told this lady in personnel, I said, I'm an expert in energy systems. And that's one of the secrets. Be a little aggressive with your. So they hired me. I came down here and they said, we want you to work on little rocket engines. And I said, what's a rocket engine? I'd done a homework problem on rocket engines at one time, but that's about all I knew about it. But it turns out that little rocket engines were not anything anybody in the world knew about. So I started out working on the Mercury program. I worked on Scott Carpenter's flight. He was right after John Glenn. He actually overshot the point where he was supposed to come back in because he was so enjoying using the little rocket engines that he had on board. He was horsing around and using up all his propellant, and then he didn't have enough to control accurately his entry trajectory, and he overshot where he was supposed to be by 200 miles. And so everybody's pulling their hair, the Navy carriers out there with all these destroyers, and they can't find Scott, and oh my God, it's going to look bad in the paper in the morning, and everything. And finally they figured out where he was, made radio contact, went and got him, and so that was okay. But I worked all of the Mercury flights. I went into the Gemini program. I worked on the development of all the little steering rockets, and by small rockets, I mean the rockets that not put you into orbit, not the big wampum booster rockets that you see, but once you're in orbit, it's the rockets, little rocket engines that allow you to hold and change your position in orbit. So that they let you maneuver in roll, pitch, and yaw. So yaw is like this, pitch is like this, and roll is twisting around. They also allow you to change your velocity in plus or minus x, plus or minus y, and plus or minus z. And this is a little rocket engine of that type from Apollo, and its typical operating mode is not to turn it on and let her rip like the booster engines do. What you'd like to do is fire this thing the minimum amount you can do to initiate a motion the direction that you want to go. And then, of course, when you get there, you have to have an equal and opposite reaction to stop you. So you have to initiate a firing in that direction to stop you. And I have a good time. Used to be when I could be more mobile, I'd get up in front of them and hold this thing. And so typically it fires a very short little burst as short as 10 milliseconds, so 1/100th of a second. And so if you're out at the test cell and you've got a VIP come down to see a demonstration of this rocket engine, and you go through the formal countdown process, it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's it, you know, and the guest says, oh, it didn't work. Oh, yeah, it did. Look at the data here. See, that's what it's supposed to do. That was a 12 millisecond firing, you know, something like that. So this little engine, there's 16 of these on the Apollo service module and 16 on the Apollo lunar module. And this is a radiation-cooled hypergolic bipropellant attitude control thruster. It uses a fuel and an oxidizer. The fuel comes in here. It's a very concentrated ammonia type material called monomethyl hydrazine. The oxidizer comes straight in at the top. It's very similar to very concentrated nitric acid. It's called nitrogen tetroxide for those of you that may be chemistry teachers. The two propellants are what you call hypergolic. When they contact one another, they burst into flame. So you don't need an igniter. And so what we've got here is a fuel valve and an oxidizer valve that are very fast. They're electric valves, but in order to fire a very short pulse, the valve has to open and close very, very, very quickly. In between it and where the combustion takes place is an injector, which is kind of like a shower head in your bathroom, which directs the streams of fuel and oxidizer in and squirts them together inside this combustion chamber so that you get very good mixing and very high efficiency burning. Now this combustion chamber is a material that is a rare metal, but it's one of the 4 metals that has the thermal capability to withstand the 5,500 degree combustion temperature of those two materials. You can find it on the periodic chart. Those of you that have been through chemistry know of the metal molybdenum. This combustion chamber is made of molybdenum with a 0.5% titanium alloyed with it to make it a little more malleable and that type of thing. The other 3 metals that you could possibly use are tungsten, tantalum, and columbium. But we started out liking molybdenum. Turns out we would rather have had columbium, but after we did it, we used molybdenum. If you turn the thing on and just let it run, this will become white hot. It'll reach a steady state temperature of about 2,800 degrees, at which point the heat that's being radiated away equals the amount of heat that's being put in to it from the combustion process, and so that's where it's going to stabilize out. The nozzle out here at the end, once you go through the throat, what you call the throat, and you begin to expand, Boyle's law tells you that the temperature is going to drop rapidly. So out here, the temperature is about 2,000 degrees. So you can make this part out of less tough metal. So this is a nickel cobalt alloy called L605. The thickness of this nozzle is only 1/100th of an inch, and that's why we have these little ribs on there to strengthen it and stabilize it. And also the funny little knobs on the combustion chamber supposedly are there to strengthen the combustion chamber structurally. Turns out we didn't really need to do that, but once we figured that out, it was too late to change. So, you know, there it is. This thing is a 100-pound thrust. Like I say, there were 16 on the service module, 16 on the lunar module. You will see these when you go see the Saturn V tomorrow. As you go out and look at the lunar module, there's 16 on the lunar module that are hanging up there. Each one of them fires thousands of times per mission. We were very worried about having an explosion in one of these things because during the test program we were routinely blowing these things up, and we had a test facility right here where we could do all that. And I used to routinely get calls from the crews saying, "Hey Norm, what's happening? You know, or have you got that fixed yet?" And luckily we did. We got it fixed. The Apollo program was an amazing program. At that time, NASA had 5.5% of the national budget dedicated to achieving the Apollo program. But after mid-66, when most of the engineering was done, that funding curve came down. And if you ask people now, what percentage of the budget does NASA have? You know, if you just go out and randomly pick somebody that's coming through Space Center Houston, you'll say, oh, you know, 12%, 15%, 18%, something like that. NASA has about 0.4% of the national budget right there. And I'm convinced that if we can stay below 1% of the national budget, we'll be below the radar level, and the Congress and the administration will let us do something useful if we can just get a leadership that will let us do something useful. So
Yes, sir.
that's, you know, I can editorialize because, you know, I'm not getting paid by anybody these days. But if I was in charge, we'd be doing something different today. So, anyway, I've talked many times to kids about, you know, I did all the engineering to calculate all of the parameters of this thing, except for the things where I needed, you know, 5 or 6 degrees, 5 or 6 significant figures of accuracy. This is what I used, you know, to figure it out. It'd be good enough. I bought this in 1952, and I've still got it. It still works. And kids now are just amazed to find out that you can do that. In fact, I did a program yesterday at a local junior college, and I said, okay, I want you to multiply. One of you kids get a pencil and paper, and I want you to multiply 27.14 times 27.14. When you've got that done, raise your hand. And I'm going to do it on the slide rule, and when I'm done, I'll raise my hand. Well, of course, I beat them by a bunch, you know, and I can't remember the answer was, you know, 597.01657, and my answer was 596. So I said, hey, that, you know, for most engineering work, that's close enough. So I tell kids, we went to the moon on slide rules, except when we had to use mainframe computers. We didn't have these little small computers and that kind of stuff. We did have things called calculators. But, you know, we did an awful lot of work with this, and then I even, you know, amaze them even more by saying, you know, if you take this thing and wrap it around and into a circle, you can have the same thing in a circular slide rule. Works just the same. It's in a circular form. Kids this week asked me, how does it work? I said, it works on the basis of logarithms. And, you know, the blank stares were amazing, you know. So, I guess later on in high school, maybe the students understand or are introduced to logarithms, but in the middle school they don't understand. So, you know, I went through the Apollo program. The Apollo 11 was amazing. You know, I'll never forget, as an engineer responsible for these engines and a lot of this system, I was always pulled a shift during mission control during all the missions, because they had a backup room for the engineering staff. So I wasn't in mission control. I was in another building, you know, sitting there getting the same data that the flight directors and Gene Kranz were getting, you know. And then if we saw something anomalous that we thought they weren't picking up on, we could call them and discuss with them. Or if they saw something they didn't think they understood, they could call the engineering back room and say, you know, what does this mean? What is your experience with this? And so I had the great good fortune of being involved in all of those kind of things. Apollo 13, I remember vividly being called back in and spending, you know, 3.5 days here without sleep, much trying to figure out how we were going to get those guys back. Luckily we did. And interestingly, the lunar module pilot on Apollo 13 is a fellow named Fred Hayes, who's my neighbor up in Pasadena, and I ran into him not too long ago at the local HEB grocery store. We were both buying turnips. And I said, Fred, what the world are you buying turnips for? He said, well, I'm going to make a pot roast. I want to put turnips in it. He said, what are you buying turnips for? I said, I just like raw turnips. when I got home, you know, it occurred to me, you know, how weird is that? You're standing here talking about turnips with a guy who went to the moon, you know. So, but he's still a good friend, and when I have special student activities, I know I can call Fred and he'll come in and be a part of that and talk to the kids. But the Apollo activity that is most vivid in my memory is Apollo 8 and Frank Borman, Lovell, and Anders, because after the Apollo fire that we had down at the Kennedy when we lost the Apollo 1 crew, including my namesake Roger Chaffee, who was killed in that fire. He and I were good friends, and we determined we couldn't figure out any common family between us, you know, but we were good friends, and I was wiped out when we lost him. But we were down for a year fixing all that kind of stuff, and then in October of '68, we finally were ready to go back. We flew a 2-week orbital mission with Wally Schirra and Don Isley, and I can't remember the other guy's name, and things went very well. The spacecraft performed very well. We had very few problems. And when we got back, lo and behold, in the background, that guys like me at the lower level, you know, had no idea going on. The intelligence community had been monitoring the Soviet Union's launch site at Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and they noticed this tremendous activity going on and the assembly of a very large booster at that point. And the intelligence assessment was they were getting ready to make a lunar flight. They didn't think it was a landing, but it was probably going to be a translunar, maybe lunar orbit kind of thing. And so the president said, can we beat them to the punch? And so there was a quick assessment done, but very thorough, by NASA and all the contractors. The answer came back and said, we think we can do it. We think it's an acceptable risk. It is a risk, but it's an acceptable risk. And so with the only experience being a single 2-week Earth orbit flight of the spacecraft, with no manned flight ever done of the Saturn V vehicle, at Christmas time in 1968, we launched Frank Borman as commander and Bill Anders and Jim Lovell to the moon. And I remember I was on shift when they went into orbit around the moon, and everyone was holding their breath to be sure that the big engine that put the brakes on and dropped the velocity so they would go into orbit about the moon would work correctly, and it did. We got voice contact exactly when we were supposed to, indicating, yep, everything was fine. Then they went around, and the first time they went around, they were just busy checking out all the instrumentation and determining exactly where they were. And then they had time to turn on their TV cameras that were looking out the front windows. These were color TV cameras, and so as they came around on the second lunar orbit, they turned it on, and the picture came back into the control room, and here's this stark, sere lunar landscape rolling in front of you, and suddenly in the background is the rising Earth. And oh, what an emotional experience that was to see the Earth in that. And then Borman starts reading from the first chapter of Genesis, and everybody just broke down. It was an amazing, I'll never forget that. So Apollo 11 was amazing, and Apollo 13 was amazing, and Apollo 17 being the last flight was amazing, but Apollo 8 is the one that stands out in my mind. And about 3 years ago, we had a reunion of all of the Apollo 8 people that had worked on the flight, including the crew who are all still living. We did it up in Austin at the LBJ library, and had such a nice time. LBJ's daughter, I can't remember which one, came, you know, and was there and everything. So at my age of life, as I'm losing friends rapidly, it's so nice to go back and celebrate these kinds of things. It means so much to all of us, and be with people who you work with at that time. As time progressed, I went into the shuttle program. Interesting story there. Actually, I started working on shuttle before we landed on the moon, because my part of the job, which was to engineer the design and demonstrate that we could count on this engine working, was all done by mid-67 or 68. We had to revisit that after the fire, but basically all our work was done. So we were kind of casting around for for what to do. And they told me on April 1st, 1969, my boss came and said, go to building 36 over here and go up to the third floor to the conference room, and there'll be somebody up there to talk to you, and we'll give you some instructions. I want you to follow those instructions. Don't tell anybody what you're doing. You report only to me. And so I thought, I'd been to building 36. It's a one-story building. I haven't got a third story over there. It turns out they do. There's this little building next to it that's no windows in it, you know, third story, got labs and that kind of stuff. And I thought, man, this is April Fool's Day stuff. But I couldn't find my boss to say, hey, is this a joke? You know, and then I thought, well, you know, maybe it's not. Maybe I better walk over there and see, you know. And sure enough, I walked over there and walked up, and here's all these other people sitting in this room wondering what's going to happen. And the director of engineering, Dr. Max Faget, walked in with this little model of a space shuttle and said, gentlemen, this is what we're going to do. You are going to be the team to start this thing out and do the initial analysis and that type of stuff. So I was actually, you know, starting to work on the analysis and designs of the space shuttle before we ever landed on the moon. So I was there at the program birth, and in July of 2011, when the last shuttle landed 1:35, I wasn't able to get down to the Cape. But I got up at 4 in the morning and I watched that vehicle land down at the Cape. And one of the systems I was responsible for was called the auxiliary power unit, which drives the hydraulic pumps that make the wing flaps move and the brakes and the wheel steering and that type of thing. And the last system they always turn off is the auxiliary power system. And at night you can see it because they're taking pictures of the thing with infrared cameras that show heat. And so the auxiliary power units are basically little rocket engines that fire in pulsing mode and drive a turbine wheel, which is driving these pumps. And so the exhaust of these little engines is coming out the top of the shuttle. You know, it goes boom, boom, boom. And you can see on the infrared picture, you can see these thermal clouds coming out, you know. And so then I saw when they finally shut off the final APU on the final flight, and you know, I told myself I was from cradle to grave, literally, with the space shuttle program. And the guy who was the commander, Chris Ferguson, good buddy of mine, I've gotten him to come back and help me with several student programs now, although he's off working for Boeing. So you know, I did after that go into the International Space Station. I had the good fortune of being chief engineer for systems integration and seeing how do we put all this thing together in orbit and make it work. As I was doing that, I got pulled off to work on this, how do we go to Mars by 2019, when I figured out that, you know, I was going to be dead before they did that. Probably at the rate we were going, I went to the center director and said, look, I love to do studies, but I've done studies for 2 years, and now I'm ready to go build some hardware stuff, which is what I like to do, because as a chemical engineer, you know, I like to make fire and smoke and make things go better, things of that nature. And so I said, you know, I plead with you to let me find somebody else to go do those studies and find something else for me to do. And he said, well, we're just starting a new robotics division. I've already selected a fellow to head it up, but would you like to go over and be his deputy? And so I said, you know, I don't know a darn thing about robotics, but it sounds like fun, I'll do it. So basically the last 7 years of my career, I worked with an absolutely magnificent fellow over there building and developing a robotics capability, and I brought one of the things, we worked one of the very early dexterous hands. Here's a robotic hand. You know, if you turn it up, you can come up and look at the stuff later, but all the little command electronic boards in here with a very fine, you know, brazing and you know, soldering in there of the chips as they existed back about 1991. But you know, we went through things. We figured out that you didn't have to have a 5-finger hand, because really with 2 fingers and a thumb you could do almost everything. In your real hand, the 4th finger and your little finger are basically used just to stabilize whatever you're holding on to. So if you're holding on to a Coke bottle or a tennis ball or something like that, most of the grasping is done with your opposing thumb and first two fingers, and the rest of them are just holding things still, you know, so it doesn't get away from you. So I think you've been over now to the at that time this was an amazing thing. That little black gadget in the middle, of course, is the palm. And you've been over in the robotics lab now. You've seen Robonaut. Robonaut is an absolutely amazing device. I helped start that back in '91 and developed that very, very dexterous hand. The hands were my area of special interest. I sent some young engineers over to the Texas Medical Center because we could not figure out how to make a dexterous hand that wasn't huge with all the little motors and things. When you look at all the degrees of freedom that your hand has, you know, there's like 27 or 29 different degrees of freedom in your hand, and you put all those little motors in there, you know, this thing is humongous. But so we sent some really bright young engineers over to work with some world-class hand, wrist, and arm surgeons at the Texas Medical Center to understand how nature had implemented that capability. And they came back and said, "Hey, now we got it," you know. So that's what we've got now in Robonaut. And that has been so successful that now Robonaut is on the International Space Station, and it's coming along. Additional generations of that will be coming along. And I drop by the lab every once in a while just to see what they're doing new that I haven't heard about, you know, that kind of stuff. Anymore, it's getting hard to find somebody to talk to me because they don't know who I am anymore. Said, "Oh, I used to be the deputy chief." "Oh, yeah, right." Get out of here, you know. So. Anyway, so at the very tail end of my career, the center decided they wanted to establish a biomedical engineering division. They brought in a medical doctor to lead it, but its primary focus was engineering of biomedical devices. And so the director of engineering called me and said, "I'm relieving you of your duties in the robotics division. You're now deputy director of biomedical engineering, because this doctor that's leading it is an outstanding person. He's an outstanding physician. He knows how to lead his staff. He has no idea what an engineer does, how to build a staff, how to get a budget, you know, how to protect his money, that kind of stuff. You go over and fix it." And so I did that for, you know, 6 or 7 months, and at the end of that time, I thought, you know, I think I'm ready to take leave. And my lovely wife over here, Kathy, said she was ready for me to take leave. She had just retired from the Coast Guard, and so together we took retirement. But secretly, I had signed back on to come back half-time for 2 years. And after the 2 years, I'd signed on with a contractor for, you know, half-time and then third time and then a quarter time. And now I just do it for free because they let me keep a little office over there. So that's cool. That's kind of my story. I've got these things up here we can look at and talk about. I've had some amazing experiences. There's been lots of bad days. You know, the Apollo fire, the Challenger, the Columbia, where you've lost friends. I was on some of the investigations on Columbia up there. You know, got to see some pictures that, you know, I hated to see, but I was just amazed at the severity of the forces that tore that vehicle apart as it came through the atmosphere. So I've had a wonderful time. It's been 51 years. You know, rockets, robots, and more. As long as I can keep limping in here, I'll keep coming and talking to kids. One thing I will tell you that I enjoy, and I do more and more, is I make my telephone number available to teachers, and I do a lot of telephone interviews. And teachers that want to do a section on aerospace topics of some type, at the end of the section, they have all the kids in the class write a question, and then they'll call me, and I'll go on, and the best I can, I'll try to explain, you know, space physics or how things work, why we do things the way we did, what's going to happen, you know, how Curiosity landed on Mars, you know, why you can't walk on Neptune, things of that nature. You know, I'm not an expert on all that stuff, but at the level at which they're interested, I can usually answer the question. So Margaret has my telephone number, and if there's any way
Mark's
that
contact information is in your notebook, so
If
if you're
there's
interested in calling.
you'd like to call me, I just did one for some teachers up in Iowa, and in a couple of weeks, I'm gonna do one for some teachers in South Carolina. And so, you know,